Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the LitRPG Podcast, episode number 252 of the show. I'm Ramon Mejia, here to bring you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and of course author interviews. I have 6 new reviews for you folks here, some from me, some from our correspondent, Aaron Mitchell. But before we get into that, I want to give a quick shout out to a returning Patreon supporter for the podcast, Ryan DeBurn. Thank you, Ryan, for helping to keep the podcast free and ad free and supporting us on our Patreon at Geek Bites Podcast. I know it's not this actual podcast, but it's the name we used for a Patreon when we made it. So that's the one you use to support us. So there you go. So thanks, Ryan, for helping us out. On to the regular show, of course. This week I'll have, again, 6 reviews for you, and that's going to include Delvers LLC, Golden Handcuffs, book number 4, and apparently that name has a couple meanings, and not just the one the author intended. Also this week, we're talking about Tallrock, a fantasy LitRPG adventure, Farming Livia, book number 1. Also, the 3rd book in the Infinite World series called Moonlight, Banishes, Shadow, and Dungeon Seeker, which is a webcomic. No official English publisher, so it's there for free to enjoy. And we'll talk about that. Also from Iron this week, we're actually going to have 2 reviews. Dragon Heartland of the Enemy, LitRPG Wuxia series, book number 8. And Dungeon Crawler Carl, a LitRPG game-lit adventure. So there you go, 6 reviews for you. But before we get into that, we're getting into LitRPG news. And in LitRPG news, we have nothing. We don't actually have any news this week. Getting towards the Thanksgiving holidays for us here in the U.S. We have a few new releases, of course, as is the schedule. But for the most part, I think a lot of people are saving their LitRPG deals for Black Friday, which is going to come out next week. So hopefully we'll have a whole list of special deals for you can take advantage of next week, and some more new stuff. But until then, we're going to start with things that have come out recently, out now. I haven't had a chance to review, but they're here. They're here for you to enjoy. And that includes Dinosaur Warlord 2. Also, Hive Queen, a dark fantasy LitRPG, Trinity of the Hive, book number 2. Also, The Experimental Alchemist by Cam Dimmick. And I didn't realize this when I was listing this. It's actually just a republish. One of the reviews on this brought it up where it's like, wait, I've read this before, and I looked, I was like, I've read this too. And it's really just the republish of the Zones of Alakria by K.R. Dimmick. And she's included what I think was meant to be the 2nd book in that series. I just put them as one, republished it, put it under a different author name. It's probably some of the same technical account, but from K.R. Dimmick to K. Dimmick. That way it's not associated with those original reviews. And she's republished it, and that is a totally valid thing to do. I would honestly prefer that she had put something in the novel description saying that this was being republished and added with additional content for you to enjoy, something like that, instead of just kind of tossing it up there and disassociating yourself with the other name, which still exists, just because she wanted to get not associated with that original release. Just as a matter of policy, I think I kind of feel that's a little more reader friendly, and that you're letting them know, if you might have already read part of this, but there's still more for you to enjoy, instead of, here's a thing that I'm saying is kind of new, but isn't exactly. So there you go. It is there. So for you to enjoy. And again, I read them. I read a review for the first half of this essentially, and the second half, after going through it, it's essentially a lot of the same stuff and same issues. But if you like book 1, you actually might enjoy this. But other reviewers are like, oh, this is, so there you go. And other things that have come out though, we have Fair Duncan Dungeon Diving, book 2 of the Aussie Mana Apocalypse. Also out is Dungeon of Change, Even Odds by Jonathan Brooks, a new dungeon core story from him. The first book from Carl Stufffield, Henchman 1 Layer. There we go. And Street Cultivation 3 is out by Sarah Lynn. In new audiobooks, we have a simultaneous release of the ebook and the audiobook from Carl Stufffield and Mountain Dell Press for the Layer Henchman book. Books 5, 6, and 7 of Enora Online is out as audiobooks. The third book in the Heroic Villain series, actually a very, very good book from Charles Dean, is out as an audiobook. And the narration is done by the wonderful crew at Sound with Theater, Jeff Hayes, Annie Ellicott, and Justin Thomas James. Also out as an audiobook is the first book in the Alter Realm series. So there we go. And the fourth book in the Monster Maces and Magic series is out as an audiobook. And in upcoming LitRPG, this is just where I read a bunch of stuff that's coming out in the near future that I've found on Amazon. I have authors let me know, like, I'm putting my book out on this day, letting you know, even though there's not a pre-order. That includes November the 24th. Berserker, Apocosmos, book number 1 will be out. Cashing in Lux Voice, book number 2 will be on November 25th. I'm sure there are fans of Daniel Shinhofen who are looking forward to that one. November 27th, this is actually a shift in the release date from the author. It was originally going to be out in December, and the author got his editing in earlier, so he shifted it to do November 27th for A Grim Demise and Even Worse Resurrection, Bone Knight, series book number 1. As far as I know, the November 30th release date for the second part of the Sixth Realm series, a book from Michael Tadeville, is still coming out on time. On December 1st, to be Biomedical Engineering, book number 2. December the 1st is The Twilight Hatchling. December the 1st as well, The Broken Battle Mage. December the 2nd, DLC LitRPG Adventure for Beta Tester, book number 4. On December the 3rd, League of Losers, book number 2. December the 10th, Project Stellar, book number 3. December the 13th, The Dungeon Destroyer, the second book in the Dungeon Slayer series. On December the 14th, the first book in the Range book series, which is The Keepers of Limbo, which is a new Russian translation story. December the 15th, The Underhill Chronicles, book number 2. On December the 15th, the third book in the Dinosaur Warlord series, Dinosaur Warlord 3. On December the 16th, an Interworld Network, book number 3. On December the 17th, the Guild Core, book number 2, Core Swarm. On December the 18th, the second book from Carl Stufffield, Henchman, book number 2, called Sidekick. On December 22nd, the sixth book in the Bad Guy series. December 28th, the Small Unit Tactics, Volume 2. December the 30th, Primacy Online, book number 5. December 31st, the fifth book in the Arkemi Online Chronicles. January the 4th, the Underdog, book number 5. January the 12th, Warlock Chronicles, book number 2. Actually, enjoyed this series. Went from micro, though, to like macro at this point. January the 18th, Rogue Merchant, book number 3. January the 19th, Sean Aldwolt's Life in Exile, book number 4. January the 20th, Player Reaches the Top, LitRPG series, book number 4. And January 31st, Ascension, a Legends Online, book number 8. So that's all the stuff that I know it's coming out in the near future. On to new releases and reviews. And first review of the week is going to be Delvers LLC Golden Handcuffs, book number 4 by Blaise Corbin. This is 314 pages of goodness, $5.98, and it's available on Kindle Unlimited. It's a little above like the average price point, but it's on Kindle Unlimited, so there you go. Here is the author's description. After helping save the country on Ludus from a demon invasion, Henry and Jason could use a break. Unfortunately, life moves on, and new problems will appear, especially for their friend, the new ruler of Berber. Being orb-bonded adventurers wielding powerful magic means they have the responsibility to do what others cannot. Some members have left, and there will be new additions. The Delvers LLC team is solid, but while Henry creates a new Magitech and Jason perfects his deadly power, evil forces are gathering. The men from Earth had better enjoy what downtime they have, because it's not likely to last. Even on Ludus and out among the rest of the universe are spiraling towards something terrible. Henry Soto, Jason Booth, and Nora Hazard might find themselves being drawn towards the center of the conflict, or knowing their luck, fall right into it. So there you go. Nice description, and it's fairly accurate. Describes essentially the theme of this transition novel. And that's a term that author he was talking, and when he was messaging me about this. This is a good actionish transition to a new big arc for this series. And once I finish this novel, I could absolutely see what he's talking about. That it's not really a standalone. It doesn't really connect. It connects directly to the last book in the series, book 3 in the series. And it leads into book 5. And so it's like this little piece of story that's connecting those two arcs and getting the characters where they need to be, so that the plot develops enough so that this new arc that's coming out is able to come to its fruition without having to necessarily do a bunch of setup in the beginning of book 5. So it's essentially a transition novel, which is exactly what the author said it was going to be. Now, that doesn't mean that it's boring. That doesn't mean that there isn't character development or power development. To the contrary, all that exists, and a surprising amount of action. That kind of the thing I was worried about when the author told me, "Oh, this is kind of a transition novel. You're probably gonna like the crafting." And I was in my head, I was like, okay. And as I read it, I no reason not to enjoy it. No reason to worry, because there's front-loaded action. There's some good middle action. There's a good amount of adventuring and camaraderie and character development that is completely satisfying to anybody who's enjoyed these characters and who's got used to the good fights that Blaze Corbin writes. The story itself is, again, it's transitionary in that it's reminding you in the first 20% mostly about who all these characters are, who everybody is, what happened in the last book, the events there, and the things that are happening had happened rather between the end of book 3 and the beginning of book 4, which is like a month time frame in the story timeline. And it was just like a really good, naturally paced catch up. But at the same time, again, it's laying new problems and explaining why the cast is expanding and meshes in those characters. This is definitely the book where Nora Hazard is very fully ingrained into this book as like a full-fledged member of the Delver LLC's crew, and she starts to develop relationships with those characters. And so it's a really a wonderful you've seen that, a wonderful fruition of those two storylines and those two story worlds between Nora Hazard's and the LLC universe, kind of combining and fully meshing with each other in a very nice way. The mid-story here positions the group again for an expanded adventure with leading quests that provide most of the action in the novel. In particular, in the story, I really enjoyed the way the author added in, well, I want to say snuck in, some up-close and personal combat and a little powering up that are traits of, commanding traits of the series. He did it in such a nice way as I could absolutely see my hero at the book, and he's like, I'm missing some early up-close personal action here, and I have a great way to do it. And he introduces this feature into the story that just makes it perfect without risking anybody's lives, but still gives you something that you, as a reader, probably want to have hypothesized, like, oh, what if these two Delver LLC characters go head to head? Who would come out? Who would win? And this is just like a perfect little tool to kind of do that fulfillment without anybody necessarily risking their lives. So it was a nice little touch that I personally enjoyed. But again, also adds a nice little dose of action in what otherwise would have been a very talky front section of this story. So I like the pacing increase as well. And the book, this book definitely teases a lot of interesting story plot lines that are developed that the author obviously had in mind for the entire series, that are going to be fleshed out in the next couple books. And they're all just fun things that look super interesting and cool. So overall, like I said, this is a good job transitioning the stories between these two major arc series. The action's there's some crafting and setup again for new adventures and challenges for Henry, Jason, and Nora. So really good stuff all around. Delver's LLC, Golden Handcuffs, book number 4, gets a score 7.6 out of 10 for me. I had a good time with it, and I think you will too. And next up is going to be Tallrock, a fantasy LitRPG adventure farming Livia, book number 1 by Xander Boyce. It is $379. Sorry, 379 pages. That would be a big price tag. $4.99. It's available on Kindle Unlimited. Here's the author's description. An untapped frontier, reaping and sowing, redemption through growth. Matt is running from a life that he no longer wants, and he's found a solution. By logging into the newest game, Livia, he gains chances that he can't get anywhere else. Matt chooses to cut out a new life for himself at the edge of civilization by venturing to the frontier town of Tallrock. As soon as he gains his class, this newly minted psychomage has one goal: farming. Now known in-game as Castigan, he gains a starting bonus parcel of virgin land that he will need to convert to farmland from the ground up. Castigan needs to decide what to grow, what animals to raise, and who to hire, all while dealing with a Legion commander who hates him for no apparent reason, surviving in the wildland where monsters roam freely, and uncovering lost relics from a forgotten time. If he succeeds, he will create a new home for himself. If he fails, he will lose not only his farm, but all the workers, crops, and beasts that he has spent every last penny to acquire. So there we go. Yeah, it's a pretty decent novel description. And yeah, okay. This is a virtual reality MMO story where the main character is looking to make a living selling and auctioning items. He chooses to try the rare farming route instead of traditional adventuring. And along the way, he meets a lizard woman who is a beast tamer, and together they explore, farm, breed, stock, and adventure. And that's kind of it. The first 15% of the story is kind of a big input up. Personally, I had to push myself through some of the unneeded details. Like, I felt like not the information itself was unneeded, but that they could have been spread out throughout the story when they were actually going to come up. It's a personal opinion, but it made the front a little thick in details to kind of like really grasp and enjoy. But by the 20% mark, the story gets on track and for adventure, exploration, farming, and you know, like I said, the novel description is pretty honest. They're like, oh, this is a farming story. And it absolutely is. That's the focus of the story. I don't want to say it's a negative, but it's definitely a story choice that I noticed impacted my enjoyment of the story, is that there's not really a lot of action. There are essentially like a couple scenes, like smaller scenes that maybe make up, 10-15% of the story. As far as all the action goes, and there aren't any antagonists. There are very few challenges even for the main character in the story. And for me, while I enjoyed it overall, I wish there would have been more conflict, whether it was against nature or somebody who was trying to steal land from the main character, or somebody, at least, some kind of conflict where the main character, for me at least, felt like he had to struggle and think, and that he failed, and he came back from it, something like that. And that just doesn't really exist in a major way. Like, there's small setbacks that he goes through, and I think one of the bigger challenges for him is just, how am I going to get my crops to the town that's so far away? And that was like a major thing for him towards the end of the story. And I was like, oh, okay. So if you're looking for like a huge action-filled kind of story, this isn't it, at least in book 1. Instead, this is really just about farming and exploring game mechanics, and like this really nice natural exploration of what farming within an RPG system would kind of look like. And there's a lot of setup in the game mechanics for some really cool things to happen. They're just not really explored in book 1 at this point. The game mechanics themselves are detailed. Xander Boyce is known for his good grasp on these and ensuring game mechanics and making them feel like they're a natural part of the world, and that's absolutely the case here. There's elemental affinity systems which determine like how spells and how powerful they are. The beast binding process I thought was kind of neat as a companion to the farming as animal husbandry. I'm a little up in the air about the mini game system. It feels a little, I'm never a fan of mini games and RPGs in the first place, but I understand that they exist, and they add a level of random skillishness to the story as far as like getting a skill bonus for finding a thing. So and it's consistent, which is to me more important than me personally liking mini games or not, is the fact that the author is consistent in all the game mechanics, including that particular one. There's a bit of crafting, but again, most of the story it really is just farming. It's the main character figuring out how to buy his land, how to get the most of it, getting trading his tokens for the actual land after he scouts it out, taming animals, using his magic to cultivate the land without actually having to manually cultivate it, hiring workers, all that stuff exists, and there's all these game mechanics for it, which flow naturally and make sense. Most of the notifications is pretty standard level: skills, abilities, health, mana, etc. The things that are different are, of course, going to be related to the elemental affinity stuff, which includes his ability to essentially be, I want to say a druidish class or a Jewish-ish main. Conceptually, it feels more like, farming RPG. His farming RPG powers with some potentially really cool offensive abilities that just aren't really used in fights in this particular book. So there. Overall, again, it's I want to say it's an okay story, and that's mostly because I like action, and I don't think the man versus nature is mutually exclusive to man versus man kind of story concepts. And I feel like this story was definitely trying to go with man versus nature as a conflict, and it just didn't really pan out, for me at least, because the main character didn't really feel like he had challenges. He didn't feel like there was ever any chance of him ultimately losing or not actually succeeding, especially with a bunch of the front-loaded bonuses that he kind of gets his hands on in some directions. So for me, that left a lack of tension in the story. And that kind of makes for a very casual read. And personally, I like slice of life stories. And so this was still an entertaining story for me. But I can absolutely see some people who don't like slice of life stories, who don't like a casual read without, tension, saying oh, this is not for them. And that's totally valid. Every story is not for everybody. For me, I think the things that it does well is absolutely in the text, it's in the novelization, the farming. Those game mechanics are really solid, and they're interesting, and they have, again, really nice potential features for the future. For me, I like the slice of life aspect. I liked what little conflict existed, or little fights, I should say. And the farming aspect. I like just seeing the main character think and plan, and things work out for them, which potentially future conflicts set up where I could see, even though they were, I was frustrated that they weren't fulfilled here. I could see in the future, this is going to be an issue and this is going to be an issue. And okay, I can see these being issues in the future, but they're just not here. And so the main character succeeds for the most part. I was okay, that's cool. So for me, it gets a score 7.1 out of 10. That's not a bad score. It's still, I enjoyed it score. It's just, I didn't enjoy it as much as I was hoping. I definitely like the author's other series, his RPG Apocalypse series, quite a bit more. But they're different concepts, and every writer has the right to write whatever they're interested in. And I liked a good portion of the story. I just had issues with other things, and that didn't mean I didn't like it. It's just I didn't enjoy it as much as I was hoping I was going to, I guess. But I still think a lot of people will enjoy this, and a lot of people have enjoyed it tremendously. He has lots of nice reviews and lots of positive responses to this. So if you think you are okay with that kind of setup for the story, I definitely recommend it as a read. But again, with those caveats that I've already mentioned. That's Tallrock, a fantasy LitRPG adventure, farming Livia, book number 1 with a score of 7.1 out of 10. And next up we have Moonlight, Banishes Shadow, the Infinite World, book number 3 by J.T. Wright. And my brain, I sometimes switch those letters for some reason. It's 508 pages, $2.99. It's available on Kindle Unlimited. Here's the author's description. Feeling unwanted and still reeling from his encounter in the Guardian of Clarity, Trent Ember leaves the city to find out what else the world has to offer. Making his own decisions for the first time, and adrift Trent latches onto the quest and is saddest, telling him to survive alone in the wilds for 2 weeks. With only the doctrine of Sergeant Cullen to guide him and a sword to depend on, Trent puts his back to the Aldrosford and heads out to find out how different life as an adventurer is compared to the one he has been leading. And that's it. And that's literally what this is. It's a very simple concept. But it kind of gets back to its roots in book number 1. In book number 1 in the series, it's this massive, story of over 1,000 pages. Oh, right. Well, it's about 1,000. It's a big story though. And it's over 500, just like this one is. And it tells the story of the main character being summoned to a fantasy RPG world without a memory as a summon. Somebody with someone's like a monster to fight for you. And as he progresses and learns and fights, it's revealed exactly how amazingly rare he is as an individual, and he goes through dungeon diving and training and exploring, and that's kind of the core gem of the story. There's also like a good bit of world building and character development, but at its core, it's kind of a dungeon dive story. And in book 2, the story shifts a little bit from that, in that its main focus is essentially to get the main character away from like the cloistering storyline and ties to the government and cities that had been kind of developed in book number 1, and give him a chance to essentially go on more adventures and dungeon dives. And that is fulfilled in book number 3. The main character returns to his solo adventuring and small party dungeon dives, and leaves behind all those larger politics from books 1 and 2. They still exist to a degree, but they're more like world building elements at this point. The main character definitely is on his own for like almost the entirety of the story, either on his own or in a small group dungeon diving. And again, there's still development of those other parts of the story, the world building in Eldrosford, or like the development of I forget the name of the tribe that he had met in book number 2. But there's still development of those other key characters that are hopefully going to be, coming back at some point in the series. But for book 3, again, it returned to that core action, adventure, character development, the coming of age is kind of story, which is like the key to this main character that I think a lot of the readers really just loved and enjoyed. And that for me made it a great story. Trent's self-discovery is a little bit muted as far as like his developing his mind or his powers, or the case. His power leveling and his skill building is absolutely great, but he really just kind of comes to like 1 or 2 major conclusions about his own personality and mind development. But a lot of it is still tied to these dungeons, and he does dungeon dives, and the action is great, and his development with other characters is great. Well done. The author resets, I think. One of the things that bugged me personally in book number 1 was kind of the characters he ended up grouping with. And in book 1 and 2, and that is absolutely reset, I think, in a very nice way. And the main character gets a chance to reset those groups and has a new group of characters. And I think it works well for the most part. Some character traits repeat a little bit as far as like group roles. But for the most part, I think it's still a much better group setting than what had happened in kind of group in book number 2. Game mechanics are well done. Nothing really new here. As far as like new systems or new abilities, the main character still levels, and I see those nice class opportunities and skill opportunity, growth opportunities, and so all that stuff still exists. Overall, I think the story is great. I practically devour this story in one setting, and I stay up until like the late hours of the morning to finish the adventure. I enjoyed it that much. And I absolutely don't regret a single moment of lost sleep. This is a great story, and I don't use the word lightly. It gets a score of 8 out of 10. I've given 2 books in this series 8 out of 10, books 1 and 3. Book 7 got something in the middle. And it's been an enjoyable thing. It's one of my favorite series, and I was super stoked when I saw it come out. I was like, oh yeah, I get to read this story, and I really enjoyed it. Moonlight, Banishes, Shadow, The Infinite World, book number 3, gets a score of 8 out of 10. I thought it was great. And next up, we have the review for the webcomic Dungeon Seeker. This is also a web novel version of this, which I'll speak about in a little bit. But this is the review for the webcomic version. Here's the, it's currently 30, it's a total of 30 chapters, I should say. It is a completed series, which is really rare. There is an English publisher. So what we're actually going to be talking about is fan translations of the story. Here's the author description. Junpei Takeda, a high school student, is childhood friends with Norika Tetsumiya and the bully Kido Shota. One day, during the usual course of bullying Junpei, they were suddenly summoned to a different world by the whim of a god. Summoned heroes with cheats, or so he thought, but it turns out Junpei's stats were even worse than an average farmer. Tricked into a deadly labyrinth by the only one he trusts, he walks the journey for revenge. And that's a fairly accurate description. Essentially like the first and second chapter of 33. this is a seriously dark RPG dungeon dive that is initially set up like many Isekai stories. I'm saying the word right now, absolutely no way. Many transported to a fantasy RPG world stories. A group of teenagers are teleported from their world to another. Only in this case, it's by a megalomaniac deity who is bored and very cruel. The main character is given substandard starting stats, while his bully classmates are given nicely boosted ones with powerful classes. And once in the new world, the main character clings to his humanity despite the hardships of the world and pairs with his one childhood friend that was brought to the world. He's tricked into sacrificing himself to a dungeon, and that starts this cruel, brutal journey of a guy hell-bent on revenge. And most of the story takes place again in the actual dungeon where he finds himself, and the main character has to fight these terribly powerful monsters and gradually give up everything that makes him human in pursuit of his goal. There's lots of fights, there's lots of levels and abilities and dark and tragic stories along the way. And yet the ending when I got there was very satisfying. And it's one of the few manga / webcomics that I've read that has an actual clear ending. It's like super rare my experience to find something with a like legitimate solid ending. It's a really good read. I really like it. But I do have to forewarn you, this is gory. This is dark. Like there are some seriously dark and terrible things that happen in the webcomic, and the graphics, the imagery, the drawings are graphic in some places. So it's definitely adult content. There's not like, well, I'm just, that's what I'm going to say. And again, there is a web novel version of this that apparently is even worse. That's more graphic and more terrible and like the worst of humanity. I have an author friend, Charles Dean, who'd read it, and he's like, oh no, I've done both. I've read the novel and I read the comic, and the novel is a lot worse and it doesn't have an ending. So I like the webcomic for that reason, and that it does have an ending. And even apparently it's not quite as bad as the novel. But for me, I was like, I'm not into horror. If you've ever watched the show, if you've watched my reviews of some of the horror novels, RPG literary novels that have come out, I have a very specific limit of like, oh, this horror gore stuff. And this one just hits that limit, and that it's not too terrible for me. But the dark things were definitely enough. I was like, oh my gosh, what's the next terrible thing that's going to happen in this story? And it was entertaining for that reason. So I give it a score of 7.7 out of 10. I had a good time with it. I'm going to actually show in the video version of the podcast the artwork of it, the actual webcomic itself, so you can see the visual styling. It's black and white, but all the lines are super crisp. The artwork is visceral. I think Matt Dinneman would, and a few of the people that I know in the community would actually like the horror-ish elements of the story. So just scrolling through it now so you can see exactly what it is. Like there's, like I said, terrible things happen to this main character. Like the few times where you're like, oh, look, he's happy. That can't bode well. If he's happy now, the author is going to do terrible things to him later, and it happens. So interesting things. So there you go. You got a chance to see some of the artwork, character designs, and looks nice. Okay, so that's it. That's going to be Dungeon Seeker with a score of 7.7 out of 10. Okay, next up is going to be Ian's Picks of the Week. This is a segment of the show where we have a correspondent, Ian Mitchell, a longtime LitRPG community member, and who reads as much as I do and reviews as much as I do. He's nice enough to send in his reviews for the podcast, and I just read them to you. His first review this week is going to be Dragonheart, Land of the Enemy, LitRPG Worksheet Series Book Number 8 by Kirill Klevansky. And here is his review. He says, Hadjar goes on a field trip. Still my favorite LitRPG series. Hadjar Darkham is a smart, tough guy. I hate to say, but I've lost track of why he came to this school with his partner Ainin in the islands. Eventually, he's to compete in a tournament. But in these volumes, he and Ainin are off to find treasure, a crypt, and a martial arts inheritance. Nothing goes as is planned, of course. These books have some of the best battles. They aren't crunchy, but they do have a lot of style and a cinematic feel to the lots of awesome action. This is exactly what he presented. He gives it a score of 8.7 out of 10. So that's a really high score for him. Generally, my review scores are up for the same material, generally about like a point behind. So that's still a review score if you're doing a comparison between us. But sometimes I review stuff that I just haven't had a chance to read. And this is one of the series that I haven't read personally, but he's enjoyed very consistently in his enjoyment of the series. Okay, speaking of Matt Dinman, the other novel that Ian has sent a review for is Matt Dinman's Dungeon Crawler Carl. He gives it a score of 8.5 out of 10, a very solidly, good, great reading from Ian. He says, Carl's Boxers. I like the quirky humor. Sometimes it's squirm-worthy. Carl and Donut make a great team. It's a bit of an inverted tower series. The beginning reminded of Labyrinth. This one is by the same author that brought the World Kaiju Surgeon. I think that's actually Battlefield Kaiju Surgeon. It's fun, gross in places. The game aspect is there, but fortunately doesn't dominate things. A good read. I wish I hadn't started at 11 p.m. Plus some great explosions. Again, the score is set 8.5 out of 10. I actually gave Dungeon Crawler 8 out of 10 because it is such a great story. It has lots of unique story trends. Matt Dinman is a great writer in that he really does like interesting stuff in mixing horror elements with his stories. The last couple of stories, I should say. And just being innovative and artistic and trying out new things and seeing if they stick or not. And he's always willing to take like these interesting risks with the story for the amusement of his readers. And I always appreciate that. And so that's it for Ian's Picks of the Week. Well, that is it for the show, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks again for listening, for watching this week. Remember, we have links in the show notes for Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Patreon, our website, to find places for us. You can, of course, listen to the audio-only versions of the show, download it to your phone or your streaming podcast apps. You can also find us on Spotify and Audible if you want to listen to us. They both have recently added a bunch of audios, and for one of them, we're on the podcast. You can find us on Spotify and Audible, oddly enough, I know. And of course, there are links in the show notes for a bunch of other LitRPG Facebook groups where you can find and talk to your favorite authors or other readers and get recommendations for new things to read. I know it's such a hard thing to find amongst all the stuff that claims it's LitRPG, but isn't really sometimes. So there you go. So thanks again. Thanks for hanging out with me today. And and until we can hang out again, folks, remember to go read some LitRPG. Goodbye, everybody. Oh, wrong button.